Thank you so much, colleagues. This does conclude the Select Budget Committee's work on the 2024 budget, but our work in committee is not done.
That's Seattle City Council Budget Chair Teresa Mosqueda, soon to be on the King County Council, by the way, giving her colleagues a heads up on some work ahead, even after the final 2024 budget is passed this week. What's on the docket there ahead? Plus, what's going on with the fees that the city wants to collect from DoorDash and other delivery services? Plus, what is the most dangerous traffic corridor in the city of Seattle? A lot of debate over that one, but we are considering these questions and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I am with my co-host, David Croman of the Seattle Times. David, so good to see you once again. I did want to point out Mariners single game ticket sales for the 2024 season are on sale this week, November 21st. 2 promo days already announced here. Would you rather go for the Julio Rodriguez no-fly zone bobblehead on April 3rd or Ken Griffey Jr. bobblehead on April 17th? I know, don't make me choose, but that's what we got on the table. What do you think?
I'd choose the third option, which is Shohei Ohtani.
Yeah, right. I love it, man. Boy, it'd be a bobblehead every night if they figured that one out. I hope so. Well, David, thank you as always for providing the good answers and for being with me. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grinds Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our show patrons. A shout out to Linda. Thank you for your support and getting involved in your community. Check out our posts on Patreon. Linda, thank you for doing that. That's where you can support our show, folks, on Patreon, hoping to get your patronage at the $5 level so I can send you your very own highly coveted Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. Boy, these are flying off the presses. Make sure you get yours. Please look for Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon to learn more and become a follower of the show. Thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge. Check it out Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. We've got a lot ahead here on this show, so moving right along, it's time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, I want to start with the finishing touches the council is adding this week to the city's $7.8 billion budget. We talked about ShotSpotter last week. We talked about this new deal with the police union and SPD last week as well, giving officers bonuses for working special events rather than mandating overtime. But we have not touched on one of the biggest investments the city is making in this budget, $340 million in affordable housing. This creates a 2-year total of $600 million nearly from 2023 to 24 that the council says is the largest in city history. So it's a big number. It's a historic one for the city, David, but it's a little unclear to me what this really means because when you live in the city that's in the top 10 most expensive in the U.S., where housing costs are 3 times the national average, what impact is this very big housing investment really going to have? What do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe it doesn't get quite the level of attention because it's like, I mean, this is, we put our attention on when we passed the housing levies and the dollar
Yeah.
figure. And this is kind of, it's not new money exactly. So they're spending the money they said they were going to spend. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the balance is, I mean, affordable housing these days can include people who are making, who are working as teachers or, workforce jobs, making what in other parts of the country would be probably a middle-class wage. That's important to have, but there's always a debate between whether it's better to, build more of that kind of housing or spend more money on some of the, 0 to 30% income housing, sometimes supported housing. I mean, these projects take a long time to get going. So I don't know how long it'll be before we actually see this show up on the streets. I'd be curious. I am curious. It wasn't maybe a year ago or so, the city bought an apartment building and turned it into affordable housing. That seems to be a way where they can get this stuff out, get this money out on the streets kind of faster, is just buy buildings that are for sale. And I think they have some mechanisms to do that by which the, sellers give the city the first notice. So yeah, I'd be curious to see if they ramp up that strategy a little bit more, because it seems like an effective way to quickly scale affordable housing to me. Whereas, putting together packages for development and finding land and actually doing all the permitting and stuff, that takes a little longer. So Yeah, when everything is unaffordable, then balancing housing for teachers versus housing for people making literally no money is always going to be sort of a tricky
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, yeah, and you talk about that delay in building projects, and it just becomes a lot more expensive too. I remember having this discussion around the housing levy because for as much as the city was ballyhooing the fact that, hey, we're tripling the housing levy and we're going to add some more dollars here, when you talk about the real costs over the past 9 years, I guess, that we've been waiting on a housing levy, the new housing that's actually it's not going to actually increase the amount of housing the city's going to build just because it's gotten so much more expensive. So I think you're onto something there with trying to purchase some of that naturally affordable housing, as it's called, some of these older units that might be around here, and try to turn this a little more quickly because for as much as the city is making some big investments here, these are big dollars we're talking about here in 2023 to try to make that happen. So I did want to talk a little bit more about dollars here in the top of the show. I mentioned Councilmember Mosqueda there, alluding to the work that is still ahead for the Budget Committee, which is to discuss ways to deal with a budget deficit for 2025 that's at least $218 million, according to the most recent city figures here. And I know we've touched on this before, David, but I'm really interested to see how and where the remaining council members, the ones that are coming back next year, I should say, talking about Councilmember Strauss, Councilmember Morales got reelected, Councilmember Nelson. I'm wondering where they try to guide this process because they're the ones actually sticking around for another term here. Do you see these three, I should say, trying to shape this policy ahead of a new council coming in? Do they kick the can down the road to 2024? Where do you see this discussion going?
Yeah, I don't have any direct insight into that, but three council members, obviously it's not enough to get, it's not a majority, it's not even a
Right.
quorum.
Yeah.
um and it's the three kind of that span the spectrum of the city
Hmm.
council, between Councilmember Morales to Councilmember Nelson, with Councilmember
Hmm.
Strauss probably in the middle of the two of them.
Yep. Yep.
um so I think, I imagine, I think Councilmember Morales will probably advocate for maybe more jumpstart revenue, or finding kind of new progressive taxation. I
Yes.
imagine Councilmember Nelson would be a little more skeptical of that. So it's not a group. It's not a group of council members that I see necessarily coming together in the next month and a half and presenting some fully formed idea to the next city council, nor would they
Yeah.
want to necessarily. I mean, especially if Councilmember Nelson ends up being the council president, I imagine she's going to
Hmm.
want to have this discussion with the new city council, especially
Right.
because that new city council is going to be more favorable to her points of view than the current one is. So, I don't know how the next month and a half plays out. My hunch would be that they're probably going to want to take a kick back a little bit and kind of wait for the next
Yeah.
city council to come forward.
Yeah, I know. So much ahead, though. This is a big discussion, and I think the council is trying to be intent about it in these last few weeks of this year. But we will see where this happens because this is an important setting of the agenda, at the very least, for what happens in 2024 and beyond with the budget. All right, let's talk about another interesting revenue question ahead, if we could here. Has to do with app-based delivery companies like DoorDash, not grocery companies here. I should point this out. The council set to approve this ordinance this week, adding a 10-cent fee to each delivery. Again, accepting groceries here. This will raise a little bit over $2 million annually for the city. And Councilmember Herbold, who sponsored the measure, says this money will be used to uphold the new laws that she passed, or she helped pass and sponsored and passed, that give protections like sick days to app-based workers. DoorDash, of course, calls this an unnecessary tax, but then again, DoorDash was not implementing the worker protections the city had in place, got sued by the city, settled out of court for $1.6 million a few months ago. David, I just wanted to get some thoughts on this. Adding this fee, which I have to think is going to get passed on to the customer here, is this going to be good for workers? We talk about these worker protections, et cetera. How do you look at this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in some way, I guess I see it as, yes, it could get passed to workers to an extent, though. The kind of central problem with a lot of these kind of gig companies is that their cost was not really reflective of their true cost, because
Mm,
a lot of these companies were, at least to start, had a lot of investor, underwritten by venture capital funds, and so
yeah.
they could afford to do things below. They could afford to basically lose money. but sort of more existentially, their business model is sort of outside the realm of like a classic employee workforce. And so, yes, it's possible that these kinds of fees might uh, make the product more expensive and therefore less desirable. At the same time, I think that's kind of in some ways the point of some of these pieces of legislation that we see trying to kind of push these companies more towards basically being more traditional employers. And if the cost goes up to reflect that, I mean, that's just sort of proof positive that they were profiting by not sort of treating the people who work for them as they should be. So,
Yeah.
um, that said, if that means that fewer people are able to work for them, that's always the kind of give and take here. And it,
Right.
similar to what we hear about minimum wage and other kind of worker protections, is it really beneficial to the workers if it means there are fewer of them? This is always the debate. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how this looks going forward because Councilmember Herbold is very much in the middle of a suite of ordinances, as she would put it, that had to do with sick days, had to do with minimum wage, as you pointed out. And I know they've been looking for more and more worker protections there, but I guess I just wonder who carries that torch in 2024. You talk about Councilmember Herbold leaving the council, Councilmember Mosqueda, definitely a champion for worker voices out there. Maybe it's Councilmember Morales who starts talking about this issue. I wonder who is going to stand up for these gig workers because as much as I understand what you're saying, this could cause some problems for workers, these extra fees. There are also some protections that they clearly need in terms of sick days, in terms of making sure they get minimum wage, in terms of also making sure they don't get kicked off the platform unnecessarily or unlawfully in some way. That's been an issue. Councilmember Herbold's talked to me about that. How do you see the council grappling with this issue in 2024? Who's going to step up for it? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it probably won't get quite as much attention as it has.
Yeah.
That said, I guess I could see some of the emphasis shifting more to the state. That
Mm,
has happened a bit with Uber and Lyft.
yep.
Hasn't quite as much with these other kind of platform based companies. Um, and that I could see maybe giving the city a little cover to not do as much. And uh, the parameters now set for Uber and Lyft at the state level are pretty similar, maybe not quite as stringent, but pretty similar to the ones at the city level. Um,
Right.
and I think there is probably some momentum towards expanding that to other kind of gig companies. And if that does happen, then yeah, maybe there's just not quite the same level of pressure on the city council to do anything
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, we'll definitely see. It's an issue that the state is certainly paying attention to, and the city is too. So, thank you, David, for that observation. Really good point about what the state might do ahead here. All right, well, coming up, a question about democracy vouchers. Is this public campaign financing program really working? Loaded question there. The story next on Now Hear This. Well, you voted for them and you paid for their campaigns. I'm talking about democracy vouchers here at the city level, the public campaign finance program in the city of Seattle that voters approved in 2015. The question in the wake of election 2023, are they working? The big initial thrust of this program, as supporters told us several years ago, is to make sure more candidates from more neighborhoods decide to be involved in city politics.
It will allow candidates who don't have like a strong donor base to become more viable to run a competitive race. I think that's the other thing we see is that in cities where you don't have any kind of public campaign financing, you have a lot of similar people who are tied to money or have a lot of donors in their networks getting elected to office. You don't see a lot of community representation.
David, I wanted to bring this up with you because I thought Axios did a very good job of asking this question this week. If the big headline we're talking about after the council elections is business outspent labor 6-1 in independent expenditures, and all five of those business backed candidates won, what did the vouchers really do? I think about this. The IECs don't have limits on how much they can raise, but candidates who use the vouchers are limited to about $187,000 per year, a cap that can be lifted if their opponent or a third party IEC ends up spending more in the race. David, just some thoughts on these vouchers. Do you think they're working? Do you think the system needs to be changed? We're at the 8-year point, and I would love to hear your insight on this.
Yeah, I guess it depends on your definition of working, like what
Mhm.
you see the purpose of these. If the purpose is to get big money out of politics? I think the answer is probably no. I mean, mostly because it doesn't do anything about independent expenditures, and probably maybe even fuels them.
Mm,
And I mean, I think Councilmember Sawant is an interesting example. Over her last few campaigns, she has not opted into the democracy voucher program. I mean, there's some people point out a little bit of I suppose, the hypocrisy of the socialist council member not taking public money to run her campaigns. But
yeah,
she understood full well that there was going to be heavy spending against her, and that by agreeing to the democracy voucher program, she was kind of hamstringing her own campaign, and that has worked out for her. And so I think
yeah,
that is the kind of limitation on it, is that it is, there you can lift the cap on limits, of course, but it seems to kind of restrict campaigns, but not the outside spending against the campaigns. But if your definition of what they're trying to do is to get people to run for office who maybe otherwise couldn't have,
hmm,
I do think that is clearly working. I mean,
yep,
it used to be that you really had to have connections and know people with big money to be able to run for office, and now there is a kind of shoe leather approach you can take, where if you just hit the streets enough and get people to sign over their vouchers, you can raise a significant amount of money and run a campaign. Now, whether those campaigns have been successful, those kind of shoe leather uh, grassroots campaigns have been successful, it appears the answer is no, mostly. Um,
yeah.
but I do think if the goal was to kind of increase engagement both on the part of candidates and the part of voters, I think from that perspective, it has had a certain amount of success for sure.
Yeah, and I will point out that Rob Saka, who did win in District 1, was really touting, well, he touted a lot of things on the campaign trail, but he really did tout the fact that he was the lead democracy voucher earner among all 14 candidates, and he ended up winning his race. Granted, there was a lot of business money backing him too with IECs, but he did have some success there. And I think you're right. This is something that forces candidates to get out there and connect with different voters. And I think that's one of the most important parts here, David. The whole concept of, oh, I'm just going to send a mailer or whatever else, that doesn't really do it. You really have to have a ground game, I think, with these vouchers, because even if you're not doing the vouchers yourself and your opponent is doing that, what that indicates is your opponent is going door to door, meeting with people, talking with them, and going as far as to say, I have your support and I'm going to get, potentially $100 from you with these vouchers. I think that interaction with the voter is another benefit of this too, that personal interaction, actually talking with them.
Yeah, I think that's true. That said, I have not seen any sort of, I mean, Rob Saka maybe, I think there is occasionally some correlation
Mm,
between democracy vouchers and votes, but at the same number, at the same time, there are a lot of examples where there is zero correlation. I think of
yeah.
Andrew Glass Hastings, or no, not
Mm,
Andrew Glass Hastings. That's a different that's a different city official. I can't remember exactly. Andrew Grant Houston, I want to say his name is.
oh,
Anyway,
okay.
ran
Yes.
for mayor. He ran for mayor, super progressive platform, did really well with democracy vouchers, raised a bunch of
Right.
money from them. Basically didn't get any of the vote. I mean, it didn't
Yeah.
didn't translate to votes at all. So because I do think there's a certain level of, I'm not sure. I think people understand them a little bit better. I do think there's probably a certain level of a, hey, if I sang these, will you get off my porch, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and you can build up infrastructure. You can have tables outside of grocery stores that do really well at collecting these. Um, I don't know that it necessarily translates to votes. So again, I
Yeah.
think it on a general level increases opportunity and engagement. I don't know how well so far that has transferred into changing who exactly is getting elected.
Yeah, you had the wrong AGH there, but yes, Andrew Grant Houston, ace. I remember this guy talking with him in
Yeah,
2021,
yeah.
and he did very, very well when it came to democracy vouchers. But yeah, that's the big question here. How much are they really impacting these campaigns when there's a lot of big money that ends up having an impact in these cases too, or in these races too, I should say. Thank you for bringing that up, David. I appreciate that throwback there. That was great to see. I did also want to talk about another story that caught my eye this week, this idea of expanding involuntary commitment for mental health and addiction. This was very interesting to me. Sarah Nelson on the city council talked about this with KUOW, possibly expanding this type of action, which is very tightly regulated by the state, to cover people in rare cases where there's a risk of serious harm due to a mental health or substance use disorder. Nelson, who is a recovering alcoholic herself, told KUOW that our addiction crisis is so severe, controversial ideas like involuntary commitment or treatment need to be on the table. David, I know this would be a big debate, and it's maybe a little early to talk about it now, but or maybe it's not a big debate with a more centrist council going forward. What do you think about this concept, involuntary commitment?
Well, I think it's not something the city can do unilaterally. I think they need the
Yeah,
state involvement here, because this sort of goes directly to the Involuntary Treatment Act. Because there is, there are mechanisms to involuntarily commit people already. The parameters around that are pretty narrow. They have to be a threat, an immediate threat, not a general threat, but an immediate
right.
threat to themselves or others, or be, in that moment, severely incapacitated. The thing about that standard is it's not, the goal of that commitment is not to totally rehabilitate somebody. The goal is you get them to the point where in that moment they are no longer a threat to themselves or others. That doesn't
Yep.
say anything about what they will do in the future, but it's because it is not, it's not exactly an arrest, but you're taking somebody's liberty away from them. So it's a really,
Hmm.
I mean, a lot of people say necessarily high standard, because without that high standard it would be easy to abuse and to basically arrest people who haven't committed a crime. They're just in a bad place. So
Hmm.
expanding that, of course, would be really, really um, controversial, and I would think would need some state involvement. Um, I understand, this is something that cities across the country are starting to look at a little more. New York Mayor Eric Adams has brought this up too. Um,
Hmm.
but the thing about involuntary commitment is, it, as I just said, it is not long-term treatment. And so for that to
Yeah.
work, it has to come paired with a longer term plan for what happens once that person is stabilized. And that's kind of the
Hmm.
essential problem with involuntary commitments now is, you talk to police officers or designated crisis responders, and there's have tons of stories of committing somebody in the morning and then seeing them back out on the street in the afternoon, because
Right.
again, it might just take a couple hours to kind of stabilize them. That doesn't mean they're cured, quote unquote, but they're no
Right.
longer seen as an immediate threat to themselves or others. And it but it doesn't really do anything long term to kind of help them out to not return to that state. So that's kind of the big question: is can you turn that involuntary commitment into something long term that's sustainable long term, and then you're back to the essential problems that we're dealing with here.
Yeah, and I guess just in talking about that, we've talked plenty about just the lack of mental health rehabilitation services that we have in our region here. That's a constant headline that we're looking at. And then the other one that the ACLU brought up with this, which again is in the background, there's just a really terrible history in our country when it comes to involuntary commitment with abuses, and these disproportionately go against people of color. And this whole idea, I guess, where I'm coming from, and I've heard this from a few people in talking about the fentanyl crisis, especially forcing treatment on someone when it's that type of a thing. It's difficult to make that work. I guess is the bottom line that I've heard of that, rather than finding ways to get people to join treatment voluntarily. This involuntarily thing, forcing people into it, it is a difficult task, and it doesn't always seem to work, is what I've heard from some mental health professionals. What do you think about that piece of it?
And I think the data bears that out. I mean,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, the rates of relapse are pretty high. Um,
Mm.
and there's some dangers to that also. If you put somebody into a forced environment where you detox them, and maybe they in that environment they do okay, but then they
Sure.
return to their social, where they were before and interacting with the same people and back in the same habits, then it's
Yeah.
easy to return. And a lot of people end up dying in that period because their tolerance isn't what they remember it being, and so they're
Hmm.
more likely to overdose. So there's, which isn't to say, I mean, it's just there's risks in involuntary commitment too.
Yeah.
One thing that I think people don't always understand with these sorts of proposals is that it is a legal process. In involuntary commitments now, people who are taken to Harborview on involuntarily have public defenders. There's a court
Yep.
in Harborview right now with King County public defenders there to argue for that person's liberty. So, if you're going to expand that, it's not just as simple as, we can pick up more people and send them to Harborview. They're going to be some pretty serious. I mean, this is like adding new, laws on the books for courts to deal with. I mean, you would have to add more lawyers and more judges, and it's not a simple thing to just say we're going to force more people into treatment.
Very true. Very true. Thank you for all that background, David. I appreciate that. All right. Well, coming up, where is the most dangerous traffic corridor in Seattle? There's a few people who say they know why and where this is. And what are transportation experts and elected leaders doing about this? That's the big, big question here. David's got the story coming up on Transportation Talk. David, you wrote recently in the Seattle Times about Seattle's most dangerous traffic corridor with help from Nina Shapiro and Mike Lindblom. And I've been keeping people in suspense about this the entire podcast, I know. Where is it? What are we talking about? And what are the problems there?
Yeah, it's not actually going to be a surprise to most people that it's Aurora, which is, the reasons are clear, which is it's basically a highway that runs through what is now a densely populated area with businesses and hotels and even housing along it. So people drive really fast. There are long stretches without crosswalks or traffic signals at some points. And so people build up speed, and pedestrians will try and cross because they don't want to walk, another half mile out of their way to cross. Mm-hmm. And so it just creates a really dangerous situation. And more generally, these kinds of, people call them stroads, kind of both a road, street kind of. These sorts of heavy, big arterial highways through densely populated areas really are the most dangerous everywhere. I think of Highway 7 down in Pierce County outside of Tacoma. And a lot of that is because once upon a time, these highways were kind of connecting different cities to suburbs or whatever it might be. But now, because the region has grown so much, they're no longer just connecting, they're driving through communities. And that just creates a lot of opportunity for people to get hit and killed. And that's what happens.
And I have to say, the group that was up there with the T-shirt that says, I got 99 problems with a little 99 logo on there, I know that they're dealing with some tough stuff. That's a very, very cool hip T-shirt. I'm just trying to figure out what happens next, because I know there are elected leaders. Certainly, I've talked with Councilmember Juarez about this here in Seattle. I know there are some transportation figures at the state level working on this as well. What are some possibilities here in terms of changing this tragic situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a state highway, so it's going to be both state and city. The state budgeted $50 million to kind of begin the process of looking at what it would take to redo parts of Aurora. There's some questions around when that money is actually going to be spent, because the state put the money aside, but the city has to be the one to kind of get the ball moving. And so now it kind of feels like we're looking out to as late as 2030, which I think is a lot lower than a lot of people wanted for this money to start showing up. In the biggest dreams of some safety advocates, it kind of turns into like a corridor with a tram and narrower car lanes and bike lanes and big sidewalks. I don't know that there's the momentum or the money to do that exactly, but I do think that there's some momentum to find ways to slow it down. But I think I think the state and the city, unfortunately, are going to have a lot of really big transportation problems to deal with in the coming sessions. Fish culverts are costing $4 billion more than expected. 520 is costing another $500,000 than expected, and so I don't know that. I wonder what is going to happen with focus on Aurora and sort of safety more generally, because some of these massive projects are going to cost so much more. But I mean, that $50 million though is not. I mean, not enough to totally overhaul the corridor, but it is more money than has ever been put behind Aurora, and if implemented, could spur some real momentum around that.
Yeah. Thank you for that, David. And folks, make sure you check out the article David wrote about fish culverts too, a $4 billion issue there that you better keep an eye on. I know the state is definitely doing that. But David, we need to wrap up here. And I got to say, your idea to make sure that water taxi captain who pushed that runaway barge away from the waterfront got some public accolades that manifested last week at the Kraken game. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, they got recognized by the Kraken. As I've never been to a Kraken game. Maybe you can tell me, but it seems like they have some kind of like heroes
Little
segment
hero
before
shot.
each
Yes.
game. So they got to be the heroes, and yeah, it's tough to find like happy stories, but that's kind of, it's nice to see a crew that did its job well and timely, and who knows what would have happened, but there's a world in which they saved some infrastructure or even lives, being recognized for their work. And so, and my favorite part about that story is the King County water taxi was only 15 minutes late.
That's how that gets done, man. Yeah, all in a day's work, isn't it? Well, David, thank you so much, as always, for joining me here. And thanks to everyone listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Show your support there financially. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.